By the spring of 2005, the Marina had the tired look of a city that had forgotten how to rest. The Atlantic wind tried to bleach the air of the exhaust and heat, but the scent of ambition is heavier than salt. It clung to the limestone and glass facades alike. The Pan-African Commerce Bank still stood among those edifices like a monument that had been granted a reprieve, its granite face reassuring to the citizens who had trusted it through decades of coups and oil shocks. Trust, after all, is the slow product of ritual. Passbooks kept under pillowcases, checks signed by trembling hands, deposit slips folded into files bearing children's birth certificates. PCB had that slow currency in abundance. At Trustmark Bank, necessity moved faster. The new regulatory diktat from the central bank demanding higher capital had the scent of a deadline, not a strategy. For Nduka Osakwe, urgency was a state of mind sharpened into principle. When the board had met in January to review options, he had not entertained the small talk of mergers among equals. He wanted a sweep, an asset base so broad and a brand so arresting that the consolidated banking sector would have to bend its grammar to describe TMB. There are moments in every corporate life when the usual justifications, market share, synergy, cultural fit, shift into an imperative. Secure liquidity now or be eaten later. The imperative converts language into orders. Acquire PCB had started as a line on a strategic chart. It had become an instruction that tinged every meeting with a hungry geometry. Chike, TMB's chief financial officer, understood the arithmetic and the optics. He had a mind for numbers with the appetite of a gambler. "Nduka," he said in the War Council that Monday, "we can try a tender offer, we can try a stealth accumulation, but time is our enemy. If the market takes fright, our share price will bump and funding will dry. We need deposits that demonstrate liquidity, real depositors moving money into our books. That will shore up our balance and allow us to line up the funding for the takeover." "Deposits?" Nduka repeated, as if tasting a new word. He saw deposits not as customers' money, but as leverage, as the pressed pulp that would hold his edifice together. How do we get deposits at the scale required without blowing our cover? We have relationships with sovereigns, but the optics are delicate. The NNOC account is a jewel butt. "We can use the NNOC," Chike shed with a smile that did not look like one. "We can also mobilize retail deposits fast if we turn the marketing engine to full throttle. Staff incentives will be wild, agents everywhere. We will buy the optics and create the liquidity." "And the regulators?" Ibrahim asked, the former SSS analyst who had become Nduka's right hand on gray matters. "If we make a sudden pulse of liquidity, people will notice." "Then make it look normal," Nduka said simply. "Make it look like we are the problem solver, the bank with the fastest mobilization, the one with community roots. Create the perception that we are the only institution with the infrastructure to gather savings quickly. Everyone will see us as systemically important. It's about the story we tell." Thus, the new directive moved from the boardroom down the organization's spine. Marketing must show deposits, and they must do it now. Adaora Layan had once thought marketing in banks would be a sedate profession. Annual calendars, tasteful brochures, Christmas parties. She had studied communications in Ibadan, worked a summer in London on a retail campaign for a mobile provider, and arrived at TMB with a hunger that fit the bank's tempo. As head of marketing, she had a team that could produce the slick image Nduka wanted: television spots, radio jingles, sponsorships, and a network of field agents. But she had not expected to be asked to generate millions of deposits in a quarter. The first briefing was clinical. Campaign Mercury, the slide read. The goal: mobilize 35 billion Nigerian nairas in new deposits over the next 90 days. The strategy: mass mobilization through 3 channels: church, faith partnerships, corporate payroll capture, and a national sweepstakes called Harvest of Prosperity. "This is aggressive," Ada said, the spreadsheet pulsing across the projection screen like a heartbeat monitor. "We can do aggressive ethically. There's precedent for incentivized savings, but we must ensure KYC, know your customer checks, and clear communication. If we cut corners, the liabilities could be severe." The head of sales, an old mercenary named Salisu, smiled. Ada, you saw the board. We are not asking for ethics. We are asking for outcomes. We'll do KYC on paper. The agents will sign the forms. People will be grateful once they see the brochure. What do you mean on paper? She asked. Look, Salisu said, a lot of our entrants are small retailers, artisans. They don't have means of identification on the spot. An agent can take a photocopy and the customer will sign. The system will vet and KYC will happen afterward. Doesn't every bank do this? We'll reconcile at month end. We have to move fast. Ada heard the hierarchy in the room. Chike's subtle nod, Ibrahim's face like a mask of calculation. The instruction to move fast was not just a directive, it was an ethic. Where morale and prudence once guided policy, urgency now did. She left the meeting with a packet of legalese and a moral residue that felt like smoke. Two things made Campaign Mercury dangerous. One was scale. The other was the human quality of deposits. Mobilizing small sums from 1 million people is different from shifting a block deposit of 14 billion Nigerian nairas. Agents were good at numbers, less good at ethics. A pitch to a pastor could be sluiced into spiritual rhetoric. A promise of a generator might look like a community uplift, but when countervailing pressure, targets, daily leaderboards, compensation tied to numbers, entered the picture, the temptation to cut corners amplified exponentially. They hired 30,000 part-time community mobilizers within weeks. The mobilizer training was efficient: how to pitch fixed deposits, how to register new accounts, how to push the idea of a sweepstakes entry. They were given t-shirts with TMB's orange logo, a starter kit of personalized forms, and an app that fed the central dashboard. The app, in the hands of earnest but poorly paid youths in markets and churches, became the bank's fastest-growing revenue generator, and its moral risk. In Sango Ota, at the First Redeemed Assembly branch, Pastor Benson was pleased to be courted. He liked the feel of corporate invitations. They allowed his congregation to think themselves recognized. The bank's agent, a large man named Emeka, came with a crate of mugs and a carefully rehearsed testimony from a supposed beneficiary of TMB's small enterprise loan. The pastor accepted an invitation to an Empowerment Sunday and, in the week before, received a private invitation to the bank's Pastors' Roundtable at the Echo Hotel. He left with free worship resources, an offer for a church microloan scheme, and an envelope. The envelope contained an honorarium and a glossy letter describing strategic partnership opportunities. There was no explicit quid pro quo, but in contexts where generosity is both spiritual and material, the line blurs quickly. On Empowerment Sunday, the pastor preached about stewardship and followed it with an invitation. The congregation could open community savings accounts right after service. The choir sang while the agents tabulated signatures. At the same time, in Lagos Island, the sweepstakes worked like an engine of social desire. The Harvest of Prosperity jingle played on the radio. Save with TMB and win. Sustain your dream. Win a generator. Win a car. Listeners spoke to neighbors about the chance. In a country where a generator is a household salvation and a car represents escape, the promise was intoxicating. Lists of entrants grew by the thousands. Agents were judged by conversion rates. Managers posted weekly leaderboards. For many managers, the idea of ethics was a friction they could not afford. The problem with money is not merely movement, it is the story told about it. When Emeka signed a group of market women, he told them the sweepstakes was open to all as a reward for faith. He did not explain that to be eligible for the biggest prize, one had to maintain a minimum balance for 6 months. He did not explain that the deposit would be tied into the bank's liquidity management and might not be accessible without penalties. He had quotas. He had his family to feed. He signed the forms, wrote the deposit slips, and uploaded photographs to the app. The money moved in cash to the branch vault, and the clerk, knowing the risk, made a notation: pending verification. The notation became, in time, an important document. Pending verification is the phrase custodian banks use when they are not sure how to categorize something. To a later auditor, it reads like an ellipsis, a place where words of caution were left dangling and never resolved. If the pious could be recruited with mugs and promises, the more remunerative method was the capture of payrolls. Municipal councils, state ministries, and large private employers represent a stable, predictable source of deposits. Persuading them to route salaries through your bank is the financier's equivalent of a moat. TMB's sales team, differently skilled and more brazen, targeted several modestly sized state-owned enterprises, water boards, waste management authorities, even a state broadcasting corporation. The offers were elegant in their simplicity. Better payroll processing, free POS terminals, quick disbursing loans for staff, and a community development fund contribution to the boss's favorite charity. The choice was rarely painful. Officials enjoyed gifts and hospitality. In a country where budgets are part political theater, the offer of a new sound truck for a local festival often outweighs the bureaucratic friction of changing bank relationships. Where the payroll capture turned ethically compromised was in the particulars. Agents would pressure municipal workers to sign forms on the premise that it was a new government directive. "Sign here," they would say. "It's to help the council make its digital shift. If you refuse, the HR will think you want to stay unbanked." The HR managers, flattered and occasionally complicit, sometimes accepted hospitality and closed the deal. The bank recorded the payroll as deposits that were immediate and stable. 2 weeks before the takeover settlement, TMB's corporate relations team secured a binding memorandum of understanding, MOU, with the board of a major state oil services company whose treasurer had been courted for months. The MOU obligated the company to roll its operational account to TMB for 90 days pending system implementation. The timing was perfect. Ghost deposits, funds nominally present on internal trackers but not fully verified, became the worst kind of lie. They are not always fraud. Sometimes they are administrative lag. But when a culture normalizes pending verification as a standard operating state, it becomes perilous. At TMB headquarters, the Treasury dashboard shimmered with bright green growth figures. Every day, more deposits appeared. Small retailer accounts, payroll aggregates, and a mysterious transfer from a state entity that matched the numbers Chike had requested. In the ops unit, the ledger clerks were proud to be generating the liquidity numbers. In the audit unit, a few people wrung their hands. Ada received a call from a young operations analyst, a man named Femi, who was responsible for reconciling branch uploads. "Ma," he said, "we have a problem with this cluster of accounts from the Eastern Corridor. The KYC forms are photocopies. Signatures look similar. Some IDs are suspicious." "Flag them," she told him. "Get me the branch manager's notes. Put them on hold. We cannot surface wrong numbers." "They are on the dashboard already, Ma," Femi said. "Numbers look good for the quarter." Ada paused. The tension in her chest was a wire pulled taut. "Remove them from public dashboards. If anyone asks, they are pending. We will verify." But by that evening, the scoreboard on the 6th floor glowed with a new reality. The management pack for the takeover reflected the deposits. The liquidity metrics, coverage ratios, high-quality liquid assets sounded healthy. The money was visible enough for funding partners to nod and for Chike to structure the transfer facility. Meanwhile, within TMB, the promotion ladder took on a new ritual dimension. It began as a response to an old problem. Loyalty and cohesion are necessary when you move fast. Incentives alone were inadequate to shape minds. Nduka needed a cadre that believed the imperative without reservation. He needed a culture that did not flinch when asked to break norms for what he would call strategic necessity. He built, quietly at first, a group called The Circle. The Circle was never meant to be secret. It was an executive mentorship forum in all outward documents. But the rituals were intimate. It met twice a month in the executive dining room at midnight, 2 hours after the official office closed. There was wine, a printed creed, and a silent handshake. Members were invited based on yield deliverables and what Ibrahim called hard loyalty indicators, a record of not airing dissent in executive forums, a demonstrated willingness to push operations to the point of pain, and an absence of attachment to legacy institutions. The rite of admission was modest, a leather-bound blue book given to newbies, its first page signed by Nduka, Ibrahim, Chike, and the head of corporate communications. The book contained a statement of belief that read, in part, "We are the architects of the future. The present curses us with its limitations. We shall overcome it by will, not apology. New members were asked to read this aloud and to commit to mentorship and obedience. Quiet pledges were made, and a pin, a small orange enamel T, was given as a visible sign of belonging. Managers who wore the pin on their lapel received faster promotions and better placement on coveted project teams. The pin was as much a vocational license as a status symbol. For those who watched from outside the circle, old-line bankers with gray resumes and carefully curated prudence, the phenomenon resembled a sect. Stories circulated that new employees were asked to bring personal letters explaining their life histories to meetings, that some sessions involved group meditation on vision and sacrifice, that those who resisted were demoted into long, purposeless assignments. A circle member could move across departments with ease, compliance, retail, treasury, and be assured of protection from scrutiny so long as they performed. Ada was offered membership with a quiet phone call from Ibrahim. "We like you. You are effective. Join us, and you will have the bandwidth to execute Mercury." She hesitated. The offer implied accelerated resources for the marketing unit, budget, agents, and direct lines to the treasury. It also implied an expectation: deliver the deposits unquestioned. When she declined politely, she framed it as needing time. She found her operating requests bounced and funds for local activations delayed for days. Someone else was placed on a special project that consumed her best team leads. The circle was not a membership. It was a market of favors. Those who joined gained promotion. Those who declined lost oxygen. While the marketing machine noisily moved across markets and pulpits, Ibrahim's intelligence work was surgical. He had arrays of contacts, regulatory aides, a journalist who liked inside scoops, and an EFCC liaison who carved out unofficial opportunities. Ibrahim's brief was not only to manage the state apparatus but to use it. "If you can't buy a board," he said, "threaten it with official attention." Small plausible allegations were sewn into the public record. A small story appeared in a business rag about a past irregularity at PCB in 1997 relating to share registration. It was backed by a thin, anonymous note. The Corporate Affairs Commission issued a procedural request for documents about a decades-old transfer. The central bank scheduled a routine supervisory visit to PCB with a focus on related party exposures. The EFCC, pacing the Capitol's corridors for a trophy, was given a tip about an old junior officer in Ibadan accused of irregularities. The reports, plausible and incoherent, created a fog. Igbinian felt it like the slow erosion of a wall. A small leaked notice here, a foreshortened article there, a friend with concerns calling at odd hours. He believed in process and in ritual. He believed that a bank's history enrolled it into forms of civil protection. The idea that the regulatory machine himself could be weaponized for a corporate appetite was a cognitive betrayal he had not fathomed. "Fight this publicly," he told his lawyers and board. "We will sue for libel. We will appeal to the governor. This is a smear, nothing more." The paradox is that legal process is a blunt instrument against the engine of perception. While legal campaigns incur expenses and insistence on proof, perception moves fast. People interrupted their morning routines to read headlines. A deposit is a tangible vote. When anxiety is spread, those votes can be withdrawn. The negotiation that ended at the Sheraton did not resemble drama so much as attrition. Igbinadian, a man who had anchored his identity in fidelity to legacy and ritual, broke in a way that looked less like surrender and more like a merciful act, selling the family to a new future so that the bank survived. Where once he had thought the slow stewardship of trust would outlast a predatory market, the endless pressure, regulatory chits, tax audits, social humiliation, and a sense that his family's philanthropies would be iced by scandal, made the rational calculus terrifyingly small. When he walked into the Sheraton suite the morning of the signature, he carried a slim folder and an old photograph of the bank's founding board. He signed the sale with a hand steadier than his voice. He felt the loss like an incision. He felt the moral desiccation of a man forced by circumstance to barter an institution's independence for its survival. Outside, TMB's machines hummed louder. Chike had constructed the operational step that would become the scandal's heart. The NNOC deposit had been used as a temporary inflow. The bank's own deposit base was deployed via an interbank placement to plug the gap. The accounting veneer of an interbank loan hid the circularity. Inside PCB that week, life began to shift quickly. The TMB people arrived not as guests, but as conquerors. They walked with the confidence of men who have paid for their victory and are in no mood for reconciliation. They carried memos and checklists, and within days they replaced signs, submitted new branding plans, and flooded the culture with the vocabulary of integration and efficiency. The old bureaucracy was not integrated, it was dismissed. There is a cruelty to modern takeovers that is both physical and symbolic. The physical is visible: the severance letters, the packing of boxes, the deletion of email accounts. The symbolic is slower. It is the remaking of identity. To take a bank is to rename its rituals and revise the stories people tell about it. TMB kept the name. It kept the history because history has customers' trust, and trust has market value. But it changed the visual grammar, the sensibility, the tone. It was like transplanting a living heart into a chosen body and then writing the donor's name into the donor's epitaph. Inside TMB's executive suite, the mood was one of triumph. They had secured not only a balance sheet but a story. They would be remembered as the company that retooled banking in Nigeria. The press conferences were polished, the advertising launches swift. But there was also a quiet satisfaction that was personal. Chike's coda that the mechanics had worked. Ibrahim sensed that the state's machine had confirmed its pliability. Nduka's elegant vision of him as the man who had built a new financial colossus. Outside, the story was different. A junior journalist at the Insider magazine, who had been given a copy of Easy's NDIC-style notes, wrote a piece that read less like an op-ed and more like a proper accusation. He did not scream. He laid out numbers, timelines, and flows. The article's headline was surgical: The Conquest: How TMB Used PCB's Billions to Buy PCB. It insinuated, it traced, it suggested the possibility of a crime without alleging certainty. It did enough. Malam Buhari Rufia watched the story with a low, gathering storm in his chest. He had seen the patterns: shell buyers, pressure on the regulators, the artful narrowing of public narrative. He had written in the Book of the Siege, when power uses the appearance of legality as a tactic, law dies in the shadows. He had been purged with quiet politeness and a severance that had cost less than his dignity. The purge found other men and women too, career bankers who had fallen out of favor, who believed the stewardship of a bank was more important than its price. Some took the severance packages and slipped into consulting jobs, others retreated into private learning. A few, like Rufia, took their loss and turned it into public argument, columns, lectures, and quiet counsel to regulators. If the takeover had been fast, its consequences would not be immediate. The country is slow to alter memory. The new PCB, orange and modern, quickly found its market. In the short term, customers responded to the spectacle of strength. An institution that can buy a rival looks inexorable. The NNOC moved its funds quietly away and the government issued anodyne statements about reviews, but the engine had been fired. The question of whether TMB's triumph would be purchased with the bank's own blood, its deposit base, was now an investigation for future men like Easy and a reasoned, furious moral work for men like Rufia. The sound of it was the rustle of paper, the clacking of keyboards, the quiet shuffling of legal files. Ada, in her tidy office that still smelled faintly of new brochures, could not easily sleep. She had produced commercials of families smiling into cameras, stories of prosperity and promise. She had to look into the mirror each morning and know she had asked men and women to take action with incomplete information. She had, on some nights, logged into branches apps and sifted through scanned IDs that looked suspiciously similar. She had a file of agents who had been lavishly rewarded for month after month of high conversions. Some of them were now unreachable. She imagined the faces of market women in Sengo Ota counting their receipts and wondering why their accounts were pending verification. When the Insider article hit, the room felt thinner. The story had legs. The NDIC investigator, Easy, would not be content to let it be a whisper. He had the numbers. He had the transaction IDs. His analysis suggested something systemic, structural, and morally prodigious. The bank had, in effect, financed its own annexation by allowing temporary crossings of deposits and then using its own subsequent placements to effect a repayment. The circle closed, and in that circle lay a potential crime. But for the men at the center, Nduka, Chike, Ibrahim, the moral calculus had been resolved in a different key. They had created a power structure and then provided the liquidity to secure it. The state's machinery had been mobilized and turned into a tool of acquisition. They had put their faith in momentum and the belief that the future would forgive the violence of their methods. Many in the market would call it genius, others would call it theft. For now, however, the bank would stride forward with a new brand, and the world would watch. The slow arc of accountability had many steps. As Rufia closed the book of the siege that night, he reread the line he had written months earlier. Power without restraint makes its own rules and then becomes astonished at its reflection. It would not be his book alone that judged them. The NDIC's small, meticulous machine, the work of men like Ize, would speak next. And somewhere, in the quiet of someone's conscience, a whistle was gathering steam. Tunde Hazy had never wanted to be famous. He had wanted only to be right. The mid-level investigator at the NDIC had built his reputation on patience, the ability to follow a transaction across ledgers and seas, to read the arithmetic of intention where others saw only numbers. He had been trained to think like a river, trace the source, and you could follow the flood. When he compiled his 50-page brief on the PCB-TMB acquisition, he did so with the professional cruelty of a man who believed that the public record ought to match the books. He had expected that his report would move up channels, elicit a non-committal "we will look into this," and then quietly fade into the institutional dark. What he did not expect was that someone, no one in the department would admit it for a long time, would leak a copy to a journalist who had been hungry for a story. The Insider magazine's lead piece had the appetite of a predator, meticulously footnoted, patient with dates and bank names, and restrained in rhetoric. The Conquest, how TMB used PCB's billions to buy PCB, did not yell. It pointed with cold precision to transaction IDs, timestamps, and large numbers choreography that made sense even to a reader who barely knew how interbank placements worked. There were diagrams, a circular flowchart, arrows looping from INAC to TMB to shell companies and back, with dates in tiny print. The piece suggested, without explicitly anointing it as criminal, that the acquisition had been financed through an irregular loop that used a state oil company's deposit as the initial inflow and PCB's own deposits as the repayment device. The piece hit like a stone thrown into a still pond. The ripples were immediate. Social media amplified the headline. Clips of the diagram circulated on TV talk shows, telemarketers debated it on radio call-ins, and the naive confidence of the early television interviews where Osakwe had promised a new dawn now looked brittle. For many depositors, the article converted an abstract anxiety into a personal fear. Had their savings held by the bank that now held them? Within TMB, panic was quick and controlled. Chike convened the executive team in a glass-walled room that smelled faintly of citrus cleaner. "This is a leak from within the NDIC," he said coolly. "We will deny specific allegations but accept that there were interbank placements. We will emphasize that NNOC funds were returned in full and that all transfers were documented. We have legal cover." Ibrahim, who had a talent for reading unsaid meaning in public events, added, "We should also prepare for political theater. The Senate will want a hearing. We need to script our appearance. Spin is a craft." At NDIC, the mood was different. Ez became the man people whispered about. Some praised him. They called him a patriot, the man who had seen the wrong and done what his job required. Others accused him of naivete. A few, with thin smiles, suggested he had political motives. He found himself the subject of grilling by officials who wanted to know who had given him the files. He could only say truthfully that he had copied the report to his secure drive and that one morning someone had taken a screenshot and it had appeared on a journalist's desk. The leak made the Senatorial Committee for Banking and Finance converge like vultures. The chairman, a provincial but ambitious politician named Senator Mia, saw an opportunity. Public outrage was a theater reasonable for his own assent. He called a special session and invited the central bank NDIC, TMB, PCB, the NNOC, and ECOWAS watchers, as if the scandal were an international crisis. Markets are good at translating headlines into numbers. TMB's stock wavered. The newly rebranded PCB, TMB's orange and blue logo splashed across a facade that had once signified heirloom respectability, saw frantic withdrawals at some branches, particularly in regions where the bank had long-term, trust-based relationships. The staff on the ground had never seen this kind of fear. Old men who had kept passbooks under mattresses asked the night managers if their accounts were safe. There were stories in the line. In Aba, a shoemaker named Madame Nikeshi had been coaxed by an agent who promised that a fixed deposit of a certain size would qualify her for a small loan to buy a stitching machine. She placed 200,000 Nigerian nairas in savings, believing her access would be fast. When she visited the branch to draw a little cash for her daughter's hospital bill, she was told the funds were under verification and could not be accessed without a 60-day penalty. She wept in the queue while other depositors berated staff for arrogance. In Port Harcourt, a retired civil servant named Mr. Okoye had been part of the payroll conversion that had shifted thousands of salaries to TMB's network. He had no idea that the accounts had been used, in a circuitous way, as collateral for interbank placements. He only knew that when a scandal appeared in the newspaper, he had trouble withdrawing his monthly pension for 3 days because the branch had operational issues. He spent a week in a small humiliation, queuing with young men, asking for the tens of thousands that were his legal right. At a small market in Sengo Ota, the women who had been enrolled during Empowerment Sunday, the group that Emeka had signed up, found their sweepstake promises empty. One had been told she had won a generator pending verification. When none arrived, and then the bank called to say the draw had been audited and she wasn't on the final list, she felt not cheated but used. Her friends scolded her for trusting a bank's promise. The word trust is a fragile moral ledger. Once contested in public, it can be spent in panic. These small human stories aggregated into the senatorial committee's emotional frames. Senator Mia called for public testimonies. He wanted depositors who had been harmed to appear in the hearing, people who could make the finger-wagging more authentic than the lawyer's lattice speeches. The Senate hearing was a long, televised theater of procedural anger. Senator Mia sat at the head, a shell-shaped microphone in front of him. The hearing room filled with cameras, NGO representatives, legal luminaries, and the press. The fashion of outrage is an art. The chair practiced it well. He had prepared questions that assumed wrongdoing and that demanded human witnesses. Men who had once signed envelopes with political money were now in the uncomfortable spotlight of public scrutiny. Easy testified first. He had come prepared with the same diagrams that had opened the insider piece. He walked the senators slowly through transaction IDs and timestamps, explaining in the patient voice of a man lecturing a class how bulk deposits can mask origin and how interbank placements can be used to cure a temporary deficit. He refused rhetorical flourish. He was precise. At one point, a senator trying to trip him asked whether his report asserted that a crime had been committed. Easy answered that he had provided evidence of an irregularity that merited criminal investigation and that any further judgment should be left to law enforcement. The next witnesses were depositors whose small miseries had come to symbolize systemic betrayal. The shoemaker from Aba had finally found counsel and was in the witness box, weathered hands folded, telling the senators how she had thought the loan was certain. She cried and her testimony was replayed in news bulletins. People who had never been to the bank heard their own fears in her voice. TMB's table was a practiced and calibrated show of possible innocence. Osakwe, reserved in a dark suit, answered questions with scripted polish. He said that the NNOC funds had been a liquidity allocation and that all movements were documented. He insisted that the transfer of funds back to NNOC had occurred within regulatory windows and that the interbank placement was a legitimate treasury operation. Chike supplied spreadsheets and a line item of liquidity optimization. Ibrahim, with his dry eyes, sat like a man above the squabble of ethics and law, as if government whips did not apply to his professional calculus. The committee's public mood was polarized. Some senators, on and off camera, praised TMB's technical competence. Others demanded prosecutions and the restoration of depositor confidence. Senator Mia, the politician, demanded immediate reviews by the NDIC and the EFCC. He used the phrase institutional capture with a surgeon's hand. The EFCC, which can be a capricious instrument of political will, smelled reward in the Senate's anger. Its Director General, a man named Gimba, saw the hearings as an opportunity to expand his office's prestige. He launched parallel probes into the transactions, the bank executives, and the role of the NNOC's treasury. The EFCC's men are skilled at writing summons letters that feel like arrest warrants. The phone calls that came to several executives were politely curt, the tone one uses when a settlement is anticipated. This was where the long, messy intertwining of law, politics, and power showed its ragged seams. TMB's defenders argued that the EFCC was acting at the behest of politicians whose personal economic entanglements were threatened by the bank's expansion. The bank's attorneys whispered about conflict of interest and the appearance of revenge. The NDIC's directors, who had been embarrassed by how quickly their deposit had traveled, were cagey. They said the transfers were recorded and returned, but the public did not accept this as sufficient clarity. Ize, now a visible symbol, was asked to cooperate with the EFCC. He provided his files, his timelines, and logs. Under oath, he walked investigators through how money moved and the unusual circularity of the transactions. The EFCC's forensic accountants worked nights. They pulled server logs, subpoenaed communications, and found anomalies that raised red flags. Emails that referenced short-term treasury operations without corresponding approvals. An escrow account funded in an unusual way. A paper trail of shell entities whose ultimate beneficial owners could not be readily identified. In the privacy of the EFCC's office, a tough calculus began. Prosecution is not merely a question of evidence, but of political will. The EFCC had to ask whether prosecuting the powerful would be tolerated by the corridors of power. Some in the agency feared they would be reassigned, or that the investigation might be wing-clipped by a minister with an offhanded contempt of process. Others, more idealistic and perhaps more naive, believed the law must be applied equally. The hearings and the EFCC investigations put the marketing campaign into the dock in an unprecedented way. Ada found herself called as a witness. Far from the tidy creative rooms and the polished TV spots, she sat in an interrogation chair under fluorescent light, the air conditioner humming like a patient machine. Counsel for the EFCC asked her a series of questions that walked like a tour through campaign Mercury. Who had drafted the incentives? Who had authorized the agent pay schedule? Whether KYC requirements had been relaxed. Ada answered with the blunt candor of someone who had grown tired of corporate euphemisms. She admitted they had been told to prioritize conversion and to find reasonable ways to onboard low-income clients. She described agent training sessions where the team was instructed to nudge congregation leaders, the sales contest that rewarded leaders whose branches hit conversion targets, and the sweepstake mechanics that had allowed provisional entries. She said she had raised concerns about pending verification entries and had been told by her line manager to hold the reconciliation until month-end so the numbers could be presented. Ada became a figure of contradiction for the public. She was neither a villain nor a hero. She had been an agent of the campaign, a person whose skills had been deployed in a morally compromised theater. The EFCC's line of questioning was less about her singular guilt than about the system she had served. When an organization values velocity above verification, who bears moral culpability? Was she a scapegoat, or did she know too much to be innocent? Perhaps the most theatrical moment in the entire inquiry came when the Senate demanded documents about staff promotions. The committee had received several whistleblower complaints alleging that TMB's promotion system was opaque and that an inner circle, the circle, had served as the main route to fast-track careers. Senator Mia, theatrically fond of metaphors, called it a cult of promotion. Former employees testified. A woman who had been a long-standing managerial candidate but who had been passed over spoke with weary bitterness about the pin she had never been given. She described midnight meetings where executives read passages from a blue book and spoke of sacrifice and shared destiny. She said the admission rites included readings of personal histories and a soft pressure to conform. Another witness testified that line managers pressured staff to join the circle if they wanted pipeline projects or plum postings. It became a ritual of obedience, he said. Those who refused were moved to quiet roles and eventually left. On the committee floor, the word cult hovered between metaphor and crime. Cult has sharp legal connotations in some societies: brainwashing, coercion, illicit ritual. But in the corporate setting, its meaning was a social indictment. That promotion was not merit-based, but reward for loyalty and silence. How did that matter for the bank's operations? The senators asked the bankers present whether a promotion system built on secrecy and fealty could suborn compliance functions. The answer was obvious. A culture that rewards loyalty over skepticism can, at scale, become a system that legitimizes bad decisions because the dissenting voices are absent. The Circle's membership list, when it was eventually subpoenaed, read like a map of the new management. The men and women with pins were now senior executives in the reconstituted PCB. Under oath, several confessed to having signed the pledge, to having attended retreats, and to having felt pressured to be congenial. For some, membership had been a career ticket. Others had joined because they believed in the bank's strategy. The cognitive dissonance was intense. They had been both agents and victims of the culture. By the time the EFCC investigators had compiled their initial report, they faced a political Quixote. To pursue prosecution would risk toppling economic titans and drawing the ire of ministers who had financial ties. To stop short would make the EFCC look complicit in protecting the powerful. The agency opted for a two-pronged approach: proceed with charges where evidence was direct and incontrovertible, and seek regulatory sanctions for the systemic weaknesses. Several mid-level executives were charged with negligence and falsification of records, people who had signed pending verification entries despite red flags. Some agents who had fled with commissions were traced and prosecuted. But the highest-level decisions about whether TMB's founders had conspired with state apparatus to coerce a sale were more fraught. The EFCC charged the CFO, Chike, for alleged misappropriation of NNOC funds, and a few TMB officers found themselves temporarily remanded. Osakwe, widely guarded by legal teams and public relations, was not immediately charged. The EFCC made a show of summoning him repeatedly, and the public narrative shifted from a simple tale of theft to a complex geopolitical drama, making the idea of a simple indictment less likely. This partial justice angered those who felt the system had been gamed and comforted those who saw in the prosecutions a necessary compromise. The EFCC, in essence, had chosen to nibble at the problem rather than devour it whole. Easy was rewarded with the public gratitude of outraged citizens and the private ire of men who found their reputations threatened. TMB's lawyers pressured NDIC's leadership, suggesting leaks were the real crime. Easy was reassigned temporarily. An administrative investigation examined whether he had breached confidentiality rules. For a time, he sat alone in a small cubicle, his computer screen showing little work of consequence. It was a quiet punishment, a way to signal to internal dissenters that the system could marginalize them. Easy's temperament would not allow quiet for long. He hired a private attorney and filed a whistleblower petition, arguing that the matter involved public funds and that if the NDIC leadership had failed to act, he would be forced to ensure transparency via public channels. The petition made waves. It cited the law that allowed whistleblowers to report corruption to the people, not merely to superiors. The NDIC was forced to defend its handling of the report. Senior directors, in turn, were sensitive to questions about why they had not escalated sooner. The saga became a study in institutional cowardice. Those whose careers depended on staying to the middle quietly accepted mild apologies and delayed responses, while the country's sense of justice chafed. Judgments in bars and on editorial pages tend to be sharp, but the real cost is local and human. In a small town in Kwara State, a teacher who had put away money for his daughter's university education found his account frozen for 3 days as examiners reconciled payments. He missed a due date and was late to register. In another city, a small manufacturer with an overdraft facility discovered that his renewal was delayed, and the supplier called his loan a default to their ledger. Staff morale across thousands of branches in the acquired PCB network fell. People who had once been proud to work for an institution of national stature now made bitter jokes about orange-branded arrogance. Ada's name became associated in the press with the notion that marketing had been weaponized, used not to educate but to recruit deposits for a purpose that was not entirely disclosed. Some bloggers portrayed her as a modern-day siren who had lured the unsuspecting. The cruelty in these depictions was that Ada had not been the architect of the scheme. She had been a skilled executor who had made repeated small decisions that in aggregate aided an enormous moral failure. On a rainy afternoon, Ada went to Sengo Ota. She wanted to meet the market women in person. She arrived in a borrowed headscarf and sat on a low stool as they discussed the generator they thought they might have won. She apologized quietly. She listened. "We were promised help," one woman said, and Ada felt the pressure of the word, help, displace all the market-friendly rhetorical flourishes. She left with a resolution that if the bank did not offer restitution programs, she would create a small foundation to fund transparent microcredit access for those who had been misled. It was a private act of reparation, but it would cost her professional reputation in the short run. As months passed, the public theater wore thin and law moved in. The EFCC intensified its investigation. The NDIC issued administrative questionnaires and a few letters that suggested the need for stronger oversight. The NNOC, embarrassed and paranoid, hired high-priced counsel and demanded an internal review. They argued publicly that their treasurers had authorized a short-term operation and that the funds had been available and returned as part of a carefully choreographed liquidity management exercise. Internally, however, the executives were furious and demanded accountability. The National Assembly, prodded by Senator Mia, formed an ad hoc committee with subpoena power. The committee demanded that TMB and PCB produce email trails, meeting minutes, and the list of the shell companies involved. There were procedural battles in court as TMB asked for an injunction to prevent disclosure on the grounds of competitive harm. The resulting legal tussles were a theater of corporate power. Law firms exchanged letters, judges issued cautious orders, and the public waited. Easy's whistleblower petition, meanwhile, had secured him several friends among opposition politicians and NGOs. They circulated his diagrams and constructed public briefings. They were not the only ones asking uncomfortable questions. International banks, uneasy with reputational risk, began to ask their Nigerian counterparts for clarifications. Correspondent banking relationships, delicate and crucial to international trade, came under scrutiny. The financial world has a way of exposing sins during times of stress. The global financial crisis that began to wobble markets across continents in 2008 reached Lagos with the force of a gale. Asset values dropped. Credit lines that had been margin-based were called. The fragile architecture of many banks, tightly wound leverage, off-balance sheet instruments, and interbank trust began to creak. TMB's aggressive expansion now faced a stress test. Rufia, whose name had circulated for years in policy circles and who had published pointed critiques of the culture he had been ejected from, suddenly found his arguments newly credible. The administration that needed a reformist face to clean the banking sector saw in Rufia both a technical mind and a moral narrative, a man who had warned about systemic risk and had, therefore, a mandate to reorder the system. In 2009, the president appointed Malam Buhari Rufia as the governor of the central bank. It was an audacious move that suggested the administration wanted a visible figurehead for a deep regulatory purge. To many in the banking elite, his appointment felt like personal retribution. To others, it felt like long-delayed repair. Rufia's first days as governor were a theology of certainty. He believed in public meritocracy, robust disclosure, and the stubborn idea that the health of a financial system depends on the sanctity of its basic contracts, depositor to bank, bank to central bank. He immediately ordered comprehensive audits of major banks, an inventory of exposures to related parties, and a review of off-balance sheet vehicles. He also announced a public campaign to restore depositor confidence, one that insisted transparency beat spectacle. What followed was a purge without mercy. Banks that had grown through aggressive acquisitions and complex financial engineering were found to hold toxic assets, with loan-to-value ratios that made sense only in stress-free times. The audit teams, marshaled by a new Directorate of Supervision, presented a picture that was catastrophic. Non-performing loans had been hidden through creative accounting. Banks had capital structures that required unrealistically high asset values to be solvent. Interbank lending had been used to mask liquidity issues. Rufia moved fast. He revoked the licenses of several institutions, replaced CEOs, and demanded capital infusions. He created an asset management vehicle, the Asset Management Corporation for Nigerian Banks, MCON, an entity modeled on other troubled assets purchasers around the world. MCON's job was to buy toxic assets at a discount and provide a bridge to stability. Its operations were messy in public and, for many in the sector, humiliating, but he also prosecuted criminally where he believed fraud lay. Several founders and executives were charged with falsifying accounts and abusing depositor funds. The new oversight measures were precise and punitive. He imposed strict limits on insider lending, mandated daily treasury reporting for interbank placements above a threshold, required public disclosures of major shareholders and beneficial ownership, and placed strict compliance obligations on agent networks. He also insisted on the independence of internal audit functions, requiring audit heads to be appointed by boards with a majority of independent directors. For TMB and the new PCB, the blows were direct. Investigations widened in scope. Emails and board minutes that suggested an aggressive strategy for the takeover were subpoenaed. The EFCC, now with the CBN's imprimatur, pursued the deeper questions. Had the NNOC deposit been misused? Had depositor funds been diverted, even for a short period, to finance the acquisition? The NDIC's initial report, which had earlier been boxed away, was reopened. The prosecutions that followed were not uniform, and they were not always satisfying to the public. The law, as always, works slowly. Evidence is messy, and high-profile defendants can marshal teams of lawyers who turn technicality into defense. Some executives negotiated settlements, financial penalties, resignation, and, in a couple of cases, negotiated plea bargains that allowed them to avoid long jail time in exchange for admitting certain facts and disgorging assets. Chike, the CFO, was one of the first to face criminal charges for alleged misuse of public funds. His defense argued that his actions were treasury operations authorized in good faith by board resolutions and that the NNOC's own treasurers had approved transfers. The prosecution argued a different law, that even if these operations were technically authorized, the maneuver's timing and purpose, securing a takeover, constituted a breach of fiduciary duty and amounted to criminal conspiracy. The trials were theater. Prosecutors called bank clerks who testified about pending verification and agents who admitted to falsifying documents to meet targets. Witnesses told of midnight meetings where the Circle's creed had been recited. A director testified that he had been pressured by state security contacts to negotiate with a shareholder who was being threatened by a regulatory process. The courtrooms filled with people who wanted to see Power&Accountability. In some verdicts, the court found enough of a case to convict technical offenders, mid-level managers who had falsified documents and agents who had absconded with funds. The high-level cases were more politically complex. Some executives were acquitted on legal technicalities, but not on a moral ledger. Public opinion, forged in social media and moral outrage, continued to weigh the balance of justice. The Circle, which had sustained careers and given its members a silent code of loyalty, began to fray under the spotlight of trials and regulatory scrutiny. Former members turned state witnesses. One of them, a bright manager named Ife Oma, testified that the club had traded on a language of destiny that made staff feel complicit in a larger moral project, one that was not being held to account. "They told us we were building something larger than ourselves," she said under oath. "It never occurred to us that the larger project would ask us to ignore the small people." The testimony was corrosive. It suggested that not only had governance been subverted, but that the internal culture had created mechanisms for consensual blindness. The Circle's pins, still pinned to some lapels and photos during the trials, came to symbolize a small cultishness that had captured the organs of a bank. At boardrooms across the nation, committee chairs rewrote charters. They demanded that mentorship programs be transparent, that promotions include external panels, and that HR published decision rationales for key hires. Where a culture had previously been prized for loyalty, the regulatory wave demanded documented competence. Aimkin, the asset management vehicle formed to handle the toxic debts and the systemic fallout, burned through billions, public money used to stabilize private failures. Its operations were controversial, necessary to prevent systemic collapse, but politically awkward as taxpayers' money appeared in the service of private mistakes. Rufia defended it bluntly. If we allow systemic collapse, everyone loses. Amcon is a blunt tool to buy time and restore normal markets, but it will not be a rescue of malfeasance. He compelled those who were judged culpable to disgorge assets where possible. The Amcon's public purview also opened the private accounts of who had benefited from the era's excesses. Shell companies were traced to natural persons, offshore holdings were identified. A few executives who had once prowled corporate floors with a defiant swagger suddenly faced asset freezes and travel bans. The politics of the exercise were brutal. Some argued that Rufia had become a persecution engine, punishing the successful for the sins of a few. Others argued that his exacting standards were precisely what the market needed, a stern, public demonstration that abuse would not be tolerated. For the public, who had seen pensions wobble and small businesses suffer, the Amcon hope was a break against a much more cataclysmic collapse. In the middle of trials and policy complexity, small acts of reparation occurred. TMB and PCB, under supervision, designed restitution programs targeting those demonstrably harmed by Mercury's irregularities. A special committee set aside an amount to clear pending verification deposits when there was evidence they were wrongfully held. A fund was created to assist small businesses that could prove they had lost contracts or suffered credit delays because of the crisis. Ada's foundation partnered with one of the restitution programs. Her small microcredit pilot in Sango Ota gave honest documentation and rapid clarity, loans approved within days, transparent terms, and community advocates. The women who had been misled accepted apologies and small cash grants, modest, symbolic, but meaningful. Ada rejoined the bank in a reduced role as part of a public demonstration of contrition and later left to pursue nonprofit work full-time. Easy, whose life had been rearranged by his whistleblowing, found vindication both public and bitter. He was increasingly invited to speak at policy forums and risk conferences. The NDIC's leadership, after public criticism, reconstituted its protocols and improved whistleblower protections. Easy, however, remained haunted by the sense of institutional failure. He had done his part, but the system's inertia had allowed the campaign to go far before action was taken. Rufia's reforms remade the regulatory landscape. He introduced transparent beneficial ownership registries, mandated public agent registries with KYC checklists, tightened rules on insider lending, and pressured banks to write down bad assets. He also insisted that consolidation must be linked to public transparency, not merely increased capitalization. Scale without governance is systemic risk, he said in an address to the nation. If we ask institutions to grow, we must ensure that they are accountable to the public they serve. Yet reforms have politics. The banking elite fought back, arguing that stringent disclosure would hamper competitiveness. The international investors asked for clarity. The banks argued for a softer timeline. Rufia pushed. He used the leverage of the crisis to impose structural changes. Independent audit committees, real-time liquidity reporting, and public deposit insurance enhancements. He also criminally pursued a handful of executives. The message was clear. We will protect depositors and we will punish misuse. But the moral ledger was not only regulatory, it had human entries. People did not forget the humiliation of queues, of missed pensions, of the generator that never came. The market women in Sango Ota kept their receipts. The shoemaker saved his new stitches money secretly in a metal box rather than the bank. Trust, once broken, is slow to mend. In the aftermath, careers were ruined and remade. Nduka Osakwe, for a while, was a figure of scorn. His name trended alongside words like hubris, reckless growth, and moral vacancy. In public, he defended his vision. Consolidation and efficiency were necessary for a modern market. "We took a risk to create a scale that would service the nation," he told columnists. But in private, he became cautious. He sold stakes, relocated funds offshore, and began to cultivate foreign partners as shields. Chike faced litigation. He reached a plea deal that included a hefty financial penalty and a ban on serving as an officer in any Nigerian bank for 10 years. He quietly shifted into international finance advisory roles from a base in a foreign capital. Ibrahim, the ex-SSS man who had mapped regulatory weaknesses as opportunities, disappeared into private security consulting and built a comfortable life. The Circle's pins were sold at online auctions as novelty items and as evidence that rituals can become costumes when stripped of meaning. Adaora, who had turned state witness, took a job at a multilateral agency and spent evenings writing a memoir about the cultures of loyalty that morph into permissions for wrongdoing. She wrote with a piercing clarity about how small acts of omission become avalanches. Her book was read in training programs across Africa. Years later, the story of TMB's conquest and the subsequent purge was taught in business schools as a cautionary module. Professors used the diagrams Eze had drawn as examples of how liquidity can be staged and how the public architecture of trust is vulnerable to narratives of necessity. Students read the court transcripts and debated whether the actions were greed or genius. The nation's legal architecture had shifted. Beneficial ownership registers made stealth acquisitions more difficult. The press, once a tool of campaign theater, found a new voice as a watchdog. Civil society groups pushed for deposit insurance transparency. Regulators slept less, and banks hired more compliance staff. Yet the moral calculus was not neat. The new financial machines were more transparent, but also more concentrated. Consolidation had happened. Some banks were larger and more resilient. Others had been swallowed. The risk of too big to fail simply shifted the terrain. Rufia's reforms had closed certain doors but opened others. Ada's life after the crisis gave a picture of private redemption. Her microcredit foundation grew slowly and honestly. She learned accounting again, this time at the elbow of people who had no diplomas but whose lived numeracy was honed by markets and credit. She insisted on consent forms written in simple language and on community representatives who would vouch for the fairness of contracts. She became a human demonstration that small acts could ameliorate large harms, though she knew they could not erase them. Eze found a teaching job at a small university where he lectured on forensic accounting. He had a bluntness that students loved. One day, a young student asked him whether he regretted leaking the NDIC report. Eze thought for a moment. "I regret the failures that made the leak necessary," he said. "I regret the people harmed by the tricks, but I do not regret that someone told the truth." Rufia's fall from favor was not immediate. He remained a polarizing public figure, lionized by reformists and resented by oligarchs. He was removed from office after a change in administration less sympathetic to his heavy-handed methods. In time, though, the reforms he introduced persisted. His final years were quieter. He taught at a policy institute and wrote scathing essays about the corruption of power. His voice remained a cautionary bell. TMB, rebranded, admonished, and partly restructured, continued as a major player in the banking sector. It had survived the storm, but not without scars. Its balance sheets were rebuilt with a newfound attention to compliance and with a public commitment to restitution. Boardrooms were required to publish minutes on certain key decisions. Internal audit teams were given autonomous reporting lines. The Circle was dissolved and replaced with a documented mentorship program where promotions were public and subject to external review. For depositors, the memory of the conquest lingered. Many continued to keep a little cash at home. Others shifted to cooperative societies and fintech wallets. The market diversified. The fragility of one institution's trust had catalyzed innovations that reduced systemic concentration. Necessity had bred alternatives. Years after the events, two photographs sometimes appeared together on timelines when commentators wrote about the era. One was a black-and-white portrait of Chief Oshse's Igbi Nadi from his younger days, a face of old stewardship. The other was a sharply lit corporate headshot of Nduka Osakwe, the man who reshaped the landscape. Placed side by side, they told a story of two visions of banking, one anchored in slow ritual, the other in velocity and scale. Both had been consequential. Both had been culpable in different ways. What remained was not a moral equilibrium, but a public architecture that had been surprised into reform. The reforms would not prevent human appetite from seeking advantage, nor would they extinguish ambition. But they made clear that if ambition chooses to weaponize institutions, the state could, when mobilized, exact a cost. The circle had been a cult in a corporate form, a ritual protection for a narrow class. The deposit campaign had used faith, community networks, and gamified incentives to mobilize capital at the cost of consent. The NDIC loop had revealed the hazard of mixing public funds with private ambition without a transparent ledger. The courts had tried some, reformed others, and the public had learned to watch more carefully. In the end, the conquest had been both a corporate coup and a lesson in institutional humility. The bank that had been purchased with its own money had, after months of scandal and reform, been remade, its visual identity preserved only as an ironic gesture toward continuity. The public, wiser and more suspicious, watched new logos with squinted eyes. The lesson for a nation was an old one, dressed in new numbers. Scale is powerful. Systems matter. The small decisions, how an agent is paid, how a pastor is courted, how a promotion is conferred, compound into the fate of institutions. The arithmetic is simple and merciless. Choices add, and an accumulation of small moral compromises will, if unchecked, buy the very power that will turn back and demand accountability. As Ada walked in later years through a market in Sango Ota, she saw a young woman using a mobile wallet to sell fish. She paused and watched the transaction with a feeling that was part sorrow, part hope. A small revolution in everyday practice, transparent transactions, consented accounts, community auditors, had taken root. It would not undo the past, but it might change the calculus for the future. If the conquest had once been a story of audacity and theft, its aftermath became a slower tale of repair, regulation, and the relentless caution that comes when a society realizes the value of the thin, fragile trust between a depositor and a bank. The cost had been high, the lessons were permanent.